All right, hello. I'm Chris Larson. I'm a 1990 graduate of Argyle High School, Argyle, Minnesota. Just want to take an opportunity to kind of talk about my military history and career. In 1990, I think it was probably in January of that year, I had some recruiters come to Argyle High School, and I've always had an interest in military service. My grandfather served in the Battle of the Bulge in the European theater during World War II with the Army Air Corps. And then eventually my dad joined the Air Force out of high school and spent a few years serving. And by being around the military, being around the Argyle American Legion, certainly had an opportunity to gain that love and respect for our country and to look for the best way I could serve. Now, during that time frame, I was giving a lot of thought as to what college would look like for me and college opportunities. So I'm not going to lie, I was certainly very interested in the college benefits that the National Guard had to offer. First, considered the Air Force as of the branch that I wanted to go to, but the consideration of driving 2 hours to Fargo was a little bit more than I probably wanted to do on a drill weekend. And the Army Guard recruiter talked me into joining the Crookston unit in 2 of the 136 mechanized infantry. So I did that in January, the end of January 1990, and by June, after graduation from high school, found myself at Fort Benning, Georgia, for my basic training. And as many know, that is not the time of year you want to spend in central Georgia. And
Chris, how did you get there?
I was dropped off at, I forget the Greyhound bus stop in Crookston. I believe it was some bar downtown Crookston, and they took us by bus to the MEP Center in Minneapolis, and then from Minneapolis flew on an airplane, which actually was the first time I probably ever flew, was to fly from Minneapolis to Columbus, Georgia, and then got to Fort Benning as a result of that.
What month was that?
That was June of 1990.
Oh, just warming up down there then.
Yeah, absolutely. So spent probably 8 weeks in June because I was going to college in September of that fall. I did what we call the split training option for the National Guard, where you could do your basic training one season, one summer, and then your advanced training the next summer. So went through that 8 weeks at Benning. It's over 32 years ago, and have been in the Army National Guard ever since. So much for a try-6, I guess.
What was basic training like for you?
It was a good experience. I certainly met a lot of people that I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to meet if, growing up in Argyle. Learning to work with others, learning to adjust to changes, not being in control of your time. I've done so many different things since that time. Nothing necessarily stands out. I remember Sundays doing our drill and ceremony out in the middle of parking lots and being brutally hot and miserable, but at least it got us off the ranges that we did during the week. And I just remember coming back in August. One of the things that stands out is we went with our 4-H club, with Riverside 4-H Club, went to Old Mill State Park, and it had only been probably 8 to 9 weeks since I left, but I felt so out of touch, so different than where my recently graduated classmates, you just didn't feel like you had a whole lot in common anymore, just because you went through such a life-changing event and something different to do. So
did you, when you were there in basic training, when you went, did you know anybody? Were there people from the Guard that you went with?
In that, now that you mention it, in that group, we were actually part of a buddy platoon. So we were supposed to go as a group from Minnesota. So now that you're talking about that, I didn't know anybody specifically, but there were all Minnesotans that actually were in that initial group. And then we filled in with some others, but I didn't know anybody personally.
Okay.
Now, I did maintain some relationships for years after that in the Guard that would run into every so often, but not initially. Didn't know them.
Okay.
So once I finished basic, came back, went to college in the Minneapolis area, and then transferred to a new National Guard unit in Anoka, and primarily ended up in field artillery, because first I was in a mechanized infantry with Bradleys. I ended up in a field artillery unit only because that was the closest armory. I think if you look in the phone book and you start with National Guard armories, you end up with the A's first, and Anoka is the first one listed. I'm like, well, where's Anoka? Yeah, that's pretty close to where I am. I drove there and asked if I could transfer in from Crookston, and they said they sure could. So I started my next year or season, I guess, with the field artillery. And as a result of that change, instead of going back to Fort Benning in June of 1991, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And having spent the entire next 9-10 months with the field artillery at my Guard unit, being able to actually shoot the howitzers, I think they were the 10 Deuces, I think is what we called them, towed howitzers. It gave me kind of a leg up as we went to the unit, or went to AIT at Fort Sill, because we'd actually had fired artillery before, whereas most people coming straight out of basic transferring to their AIT didn't have any experience with artillery until they were actually taught it.
What kind of cannons were those?
They would have been 105 millimeters, but okay. I believe they were 102s, was the nomenclature that we used. Spent another 8 weeks at Fort Sill, and that was a challenge only because over the course of the year you had pretty much gotten out of the basic training mindset, and knowing that you were going back was hard. I don't know that I would recommend soldiers today to do that, but it was the option that was given, and it worked out with my schooling. But that was another long summer of 1991, and Fort Sill, I don't think I've been back. I've been back to Fort Benning since that time, but I don't think I've ever been to Fort Sill since I graduated from AIT in 1991.
What months were you there, Fort Sill?
I was there from, June to August, and I remember sitting in our day room. Yeah, absolutely. I remember, I get my years right. So in 1990 in basic, it was probably like August 2nd or 3rd. And I remember a drill sergeant saying, good luck, take care, privates. I'll see you in Iraq or something of that sort, because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait like the day before, and that would have been the build up to Operation Desert Shield, which then led to Desert Storm. Fortunately, of course, we didn't get called up from many units. I think probably a couple of units from the National Guard got called up, but by the time I went to AIT at Fort Sill, Desert Storm was over. So it was just business as usual. Graduated in August of 1990, I guess, and then went back to just doing regular Guard drills with the unit out of Anoka, and then picked up, I guess, my college career. I was going for social studies education at University of Northwestern St. Paul. It used to be called Northwestern College. So I continued living in the St. Paul area. In somewhere around 92, the Anoka Armory with the field artillery was being changed over to a new unit. So I ended up transferring to a unit out of Roseville and that was a military police company, and that was my first exposure then to becoming an MP. So I was probably a PFC at that time, and was sent off to training as what we called a 95 Bravo military policeman, and had a great couple of years of, I was able to go to Honduras for my annual training period at Sotocano Air Force Base, and then the following year went to Panama City to be a military policeman in Panama for a couple of weeks for annual training. And then in 1995, by that time I'd been in 5 years, had graduated from college, had gotten married to my wife Roxanne, and took a teaching position in Traverse City, Michigan. So all of that happened within that 5-year time period, and then was pretty certain I was probably going to get out of the National Guard. Moved to Michigan, ended up getting into a guard unit, a military police unit out of Camp Grayling, Michigan, and just planned on finishing up my time. And like anybody that knows any experience with the military, they have a tendency to screw up paperwork. And during that moment, it was somewhere in that time frame where they were supposed to pay my college loans. We had part of our program, and they had student loan repayment programs. And that was when the first payment was supposed to come due. And I got a call, and it was the incentives officer, and he said, "Hey, listen," he said, "I've got your paperwork here. I'm ready to cut a check, but you are not in a current enlistment. You're in what we called a Tri-1. It was after, so this would have been probably 96, 97. And because you are not in a 3-year enlistment, I can't pay it. But if you commit, then we can make the payment." So my wife was very anxious for me to get out of the Guard, and I wanted to as well, but I thought, well, I'm already in one, what's a couple more? So I agreed to that, and at that point then they processed everything, and was able to move past that, but that was kind of then just continuing down the path of what was supposed to be a real short period extending. In 1997, in the spring of 97, I was at guard drill with a deputy sheriff from Traverse County. He was my patrol mate, and while we were there, he was interested in becoming a warrant officer. And I'm like, whatever. And he said, "So I got to go see the officer recruiter." Like, all right. So as you know, patrols, we go together. So we traveled over to the side of posts that had the officer recruiter, and I'm standing in the background, and he's talking to him. And then the officer looks over at me and says, "Hey, what do you do?" And I was a specialist. So he says, "Specialist Larson, what do you do?" I said, "I'm a school teacher." He said, "You're a school teacher? Where?" And I said, "Traverse City." He said, "You got a bachelor's degree?" I said, "Of course, I'm a school teacher." So why aren't you an officer? I said, "No one's ever asked. I have no idea how to do it." He said, "Well, you should go to officer candidate school." I'm like, really? So he gave me paperwork, and April of 97, it started 16 months of root canal, as I used to call it, of misery, going once a month to officer candidate school at Fort Custer, Michigan, and was commissioned a second lieutenant in August of 1998.
Why don't you go ahead and explain a little of that root canal?
The root canal. So officer candidate school is worse than basic training. And I say that because the physical demands are still there, but the expectation is so much higher. So to be able to serve as a platoon leader or a company commander, you need to have confidence. You need to exhibit confidence and ability to make and to have your platoon, your men follow you. So you have to pretty much be able to have done most of the things that you're asking them to do. So every month, through very little sleep, starting Friday nights, we would report. We would have very early PT, physical training in the morning, have classes most of the day, do field training exercises, very regimented. For instance, and they still do it today, just a couple weeks ago, I was at a cake cutting ceremony for the Army's birthday, and there was officer candidates there, and I was just making conversation, and you do the same repetition. When you ask an officer candidate their name, they have to say, "Sir, Officer Candidate Larson, sir." Or if they want to ask a question, you have to start out that same mantra every time. So if I'm asking you a question, it'll be, "Sir, Officer Candidate Larson, sir, what time is the briefing today?" So that mantra is just drilled into you, and that's the regimented portion. And then after you get done on a Sunday night, late evening, you drive back to wherever your home is, and then you'd get ready for the next weekend, 4 weeks later, and you'd do it again and again. On the active duty for the Army, you'd go to Fort Benning, and you would do it for 90 days, and they used to call it the 90-day wonder, which was being enlisted, going to officer candidate school, and then getting commissioned to second lieutenant. So that's the process of what we went through. But when I say a root canal, it was just so painful for so long, but so rewarding. It was probably more rewarding for me to earn my commission as a second lieutenant than it was a bachelor's degree in college, just because of the sheer willpower it takes to complete that process.
When you went to Fort Benning, did they also call it? Was that shake and bake? Is that? I've heard that term before.
That's a term that they would have used. Yep, a shake and bake officer. Compared to ROTC, which is, an ROTC cadet goes to 4 years of reserve officer training corps at a college. So, yeah, I would say that a shake and bake is another term I've heard used.
I know,
a 90-day wonder.
I've heard that once in a while. Just wondering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I remember my mom and dad came out to Traverse City. Actually, it was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where we had the commissioning ceremony, and were able to see me commissioned a second lieutenant and start me on my officer career. So,
well, as you're talking about your mom and dad there, Chris, how'd they feel about you being in the military?
My dad was very supportive. My mom was very hesitant. I remember my mom saying that when she dropped me off at that bus station, she sat in the vehicle and cried for, probably a good half hour after, her baby, I was the youngest of the family, was going off on this great unknown. And I even remember the recruiter sitting in our kitchen, and my mom asking, "Well, he won't ever have to go to war, will he?" And he said, "Oh no, they won't call the National Guard unless it's World War III. It would have to be like World War II or something of that sort." Well, yeah, as I spent 2009 to 2010 in Iraq, so much for not going anywhere. But
I know your mom dreaded every minute of it.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, so she was very hesitant but very proud, and as my dad was. And supported me throughout my career and as I continued through. So,
good.
Well, I guess picking up on the timeline, another big step then we had was as a newly commissioned officer, you have to go to officer basic course, which is an active duty course. So within the Army, we then had to go to for me as an ordnance officers are responsible for munitions and maintenance of equipment. So the munitions meaning the ammunition, managing an ammunition supply point where all the stuff is kept. Maintenance meaning basically think of a diesel mechanic, think of a track repair, somebody who's fixing the Caterpillars, fixing the vehicles. That's what an ordnance officer does. So I went off to Aberdeen Proving Ground in August of 1999. My wife was able to come with me. We called it, we used the term gentleman's course. A gentleman's course is contrasted with a basic training. Basic training is, kind of treated like a dirt the whole time. A gentleman's course is you're treated with respect and dignity, and you kind of go to classes during the day. You come back to your house at night and can do things on the weekends, things of that sort. So she lived out there with me in Aberdeen, and while I was there, we were pregnant with our first son. So my first son, Cameron, was born in Baltimore, Maryland, while we were living out in Aberdeen. And what was kind of unique about that is we were driving to the hospital at 1 o'clock in the morning to Baltimore. And when she went into labor, and there was a sign that said, "Next exit, Camden Yards." And she said, "What do you think of the name Cameron?" Hey, I said, "Sounds good to me." So that's how he got his name, as a result of driving by the exit for Camden Yards. So he's always had a love for the Baltimore Orioles as a result of his namesake. So went to officer basic course, did that for 6 months, came back, moved back to Minnesota in Fergus Falls, where my wife's family was from. And eventually that fall, November of 2000, took a job with the Minnesota Army National Guard full-time out here at Camp Ripley, where I'm sitting right now, and started working Monday through Friday here, and then would do drill weekends.
You've been there for 22 years?
I had, yeah, physically
Wow.
working here for 22 years, yep, driving every day. During that time frame, I was given command of a unit in Long Prairie, and while I was there, we were looking for a place to live, went for a drive at lunch, and saw some property on the edge of town in Long Prairie, and I thought, well, that looks pretty decent. There's a new subdivision. I invited my wife to drive over from Fergus, and as a result, that's where we settled, built a house in February, March of 2002, and have lived there ever since. So that's how we ended up in Long Prairie, was the fact that that's the guard unit that I was assigned to. For about 5 months, I was able to go home at lunch for guard drill, and promptly they transferred me to Duluth to be the commander of the Duluth unit. That was just the next natural step, but I always kind of joke that, just typical Army for 5 months, that, I actually had good things good, so they figured it out, so then they moved me.
What's your rank at this time?
At that point, I was a captain.
Okay.
So I went from, I was a first lieutenant while I was in Long Prairie, and then promoted to captain and took company command in Duluth. I should point out, when I was applying for full-time jobs here at Camp Ripley, I applied for a job in August of 2001, was waiting to hear back about the job selection. Was September 11th, 2001. Didn't get a call because, of course, the World Trade Centers collapsed. And the next day was notified that I did get a job, selected for a permanent position. And they were going to call me the day before, but of course the world fell apart. So immediately we went into post 9/11 mode, with the National Guard being activated in different locations, different reasons. And in the winter of February of 2003, I was activated as the company commander for a unit to guard the air base up in Duluth, the 148th Fighter Wing. So if you recall, during that time frame, guardsmen were guarding airports, and we were on high alert. You couldn't go through airport without seeing a guardsman standing there with an M16. Very scary times. And also all of our air bases where the military planes were kept were really locked down, and they needed extra support, so they activated the Army National Guard to guard the air bases, which is the Air National Guard. So I spent that year living in Duluth, which is the strangest thing to get deployed to Duluth, but lived down on Canal Park, and would then drive up to the air base of the 148th, and my soldiers guarded the F-16s that were stationed there during that time. So brought me through 2004, in which my next son was born, Benjamin, and which he just graduated from high school. So it was 18 years ago. And came back in 2004, continued my career here at Camp Ripley, and moved around to several different positions as I made rank, and was promoted to major in 2008. My guard units tended to mostly be in the Twin Cities area. So I would drive on a Friday night to guard drill, and then on Sunday night come back, and then continue working at Camp Ripley Monday through Friday. And in 2008 was transferred to the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls, in preparation for a deployment to Iraq in Basra, which is the far southern city of Iraq. And we went through a lot of training, went through a lot of exercises. One fun part of that was we did a 3-week training exercise in Hawaii. So we were able to go to Honolulu and spend 3 weeks training up at the Schofield Barracks, which was a neat experience. And one thing I can just say is throughout my Army career, I've had amazing opportunity to travel, to go places that I would never have probably expected to do. And getting to stay in Hawaii for 3 weeks was pretty neat. And we lived right off of Waikiki in a hotel. And every morning we'd take a van and drive up to Schofield Barracks and work for 12 hours and then turn around and come back to Waikiki in the evening. And that was pretty neat. In February of 2009, then the 34th ID was activated officially, and we reported to Fort Lewis, Washington. I took an opportunity, just about a week ago in preparation for this. I listened to our good friend Kenny Kuznia's video and was curious. Kenny, of course, is a dear friend of all of ours. And he had stated that he had went to Fort Lewis as part of his training when you had interviewed him, and had stayed in the barracks there. And I couldn't help but think I probably was staying in the same barracks, because if you go to Fort Lewis today, they have what's called North Fort Lewis, and that is the oldest part, and that is 1950s, 60s style barracks that are still there. And they are older than dirt, and they're horrible. I can't believe we all didn't get extremely sick. I think everybody got sick while we were staying there. It was just so cold and damp and rainy, and the barracks were miserable. The kitchens were horrible. But we were there about 3 months in preparation, 2.5 months in preparation for to fly overseas to Iraq. And during that time, we, as a division headquarters, you're overseeing 3 to 4 brigades underneath us. Brigades are about 3,500 soldiers per brigade. Divisions tend to be about 12,000 people strong. So a division headquarters has a 2-star general, a couple generals, and then a bunch of colonels underneath, and then all the supporting staff. And we did what we called an MRX, a mobilization readiness exercise. And those are opportunities where the Army will actually role play digitally what happens on the battlefield, and everybody has responses to do, and it's pretty neat how you do it in this super secret facility, and you're able to take action. They'll introduce, in this case, they'd say that a mosque was blowing up, insurgents were attacking certain places, and commanding general would make a decision as to what should be done, and then everybody else had to follow suit with the appropriate responses. So that's the type of training we did. It wasn't physical training. It wasn't where you running through confidence courses or anything of that sort. This was because we were managing a division. It was mostly sitting behind computers and functioning. And then we shipped out on tax day, April 15th, flew to Kuwait, and then a week later, took helicopters. We took UH-60 Blackhawks and C-130s into Iraq, and just unbelievable experience to first go from the cold of Fort Lewis in April to, and leave everything behind, say goodbye to your family. My wife did get a chance with the boys to come out and see me briefly for a week-long weekend in April, and then that following week we shipped out to say goodbye for, in effect, 9-10 months. And to land in Kuwait with 95-degree heat, and then following, about a week later, fly into Iraq. I remember being on the C-130s. You got all your gear. It's hotter than blazes. We utilized, instead of flak vests, by this time you had actual armored plating vests, or we call it IOTVs. But so you weigh probably 40 pounds more than you're supposed to, and you're just wet all the way through. And as we're coming in, they do these combat lands in order to get below any potential rocket-propelled grenades. They would just dive down to the tarmac and about lose your cookies as they're diving. And then we landed at Basra and said hello to my new home for 9-10 months while I was in Iraq, and left. I left on Groundhog's Day in February 2nd, 2010, which, everybody always says Groundhog's Day that is kind of unique to us, because when you're in these situations of deployments, every day is the same. You do the same routine, the same, and then to actually leave on Groundhog's Day was kind of funny, because it was the same, but it was also the longest day I've ever had, because I left at like 5 in the morning, maybe 4 in the morning on February 2nd, but because of the international time zone and the length of time, we added, and we were 9 hours ahead, and then we flew to Fort Lewis again. So we went across the whole time zones, which was 13 hours. So my day of actual clock time was somewhere around 34 hours or some crazy thing. And then we landed at Fort Lewis at like 9 o'clock at night.
But when you were there, you went as a unit, right? So you knew everybody that was there.
I knew everybody. We had worked together since August of 2008. So yeah, and many of the people that I worked with, I had lunch with every day, that we ate with, that we trained with, I still see in the Guard today, that we still serve with. We're getting older, so there's fewer and fewer, but even today, just visiting with some people.
That means a lot, being with
absolutely
with the people.
Those lifelong relationships. Yeah. I just, as I was telling you, I just came back from a promotion ceremony, and attendees at that ceremony I had served with in Basra, and the woman who was getting promoted to lieutenant colonel had been in Basra with us in 2009.
What's your rank now, Chris?
I'm a colonel, so I'm a 06 colonel. So a lot of years, and that takes a lot of years to get there. So we last talked, I was coming back in 2010 from Fort Lewis. The experience of coming home from a deployment, from a war zone, is absolutely phenomenal. I understand, it was a year. I can't even imagine the soldiers and airmen and sailors that went off during World War II not knowing when they would come back. Recognizing in Vietnam, coming back after a year tour of such horrible experiences, and not being welcomed home. We had the privilege of coming back on an airplane from Fort Lewis, being met at the airport with fire trucks and police cars, and being loaded onto buses to be brought back to the armory in Rosemount, Minnesota, south of the cities, and knowing that my family, they were waiting for me. My boys and my wife were there, my mom and dad, and everybody had come out, and just to be welcomed off that bus. And we did a final formation where everybody joined up on the armory floor, and then the company commander said dismiss, and we were able to run into the arms of our loved ones, and still get teary-eyed when you see the pictures of my sons in my arms, and my youngest Ben, who's now 18, on my shoulders, and being able to embrace my wife and my parents was just unbelievable. And it's an experience that you'll never forget. So came back that first year after I did return to work at Camp Ripley, and our guard drill weekends were pretty low key. And then we kind of built up again and had some unique opportunities that the Army has given me. In 2011, I was able to go to Grafenwehr, Germany to do an exercise, and was there for about 2 to 3 weeks. Spent Easter morning in a sunrise service looking out over Germany, and that was pretty amazing. And the following year, in February, I was able to go to Tokyo, Japan, for a training exercise called Yamasakura, and we trained with the Japanese Army while we were there, and was able to do that for 3 weeks, living in tents and experiencing our Japanese allies, in just seeing the amazing order that the Japanese have. Every tent was dressed perfectly set up with pallets for sidewalks in between, and latrines that were off on one corner that were just perfectly aligned. And you'd walk into the dining facility, and our Japanese fellow soldiers would be eating bowls of rice, and we're just thinking, how in the world can you get by on that? And we're eating our American food. So that was a great experience, and that was in 2012, and came back from that and served in a number of different positions, served in different roles and responsibilities. Haven't had any overseas deployments since that time. I have been able to watch my kids grow, attend graduation ceremonies and baseball games and all those fun things that some of my other fellow soldiers ended up going back to different deployments, but just based off the positions I've been in, it's kind of passed me by. In 2016, spent some time down in National Training Center in the Mojave Desert in California, which 105, 110 degrees, observing training there as the logistics officer for the 34th ID, and was not in the exercise per se, but assisting in the establishment of it and learning what true heat is. It reminded me of our time in Iraq. This was in June of 2016. And then eventually transferred to the state headquarters for Minnesota, and have been serving in positions here in the state headquarters. Was called to state active duty in June of 2020 to serve down in St. Paul during the Minneapolis riots, and spent 9 days down in state capital area.
What did that involve, Chris? What did you have to do?
Kind of the way that unfolded. If you recall, on May 25th, George Floyd was killed by police officers, as the jury decision ended up being, and civil unrest started really that evening and Tuesday. By Wednesday, the Minnesota Guard had activated a couple of different units to provide support to civil authorities. And by Thursday, it was pretty relevant that it was getting out of control, that the city of Minneapolis did not have enough people, enough police officers to actually maintain. We didn't have enough guardsmen available in the area that were providing support, and that consisted of Humvees, armed soldiers driving up and down the streets, but we just didn't have the capabilities. On Friday night, things continued to deteriorate, and Minnesota National Guard had a pretty large, I don't say exercise, but drill weekend going on at Camp Ripley. and I got a call at 2 a.m. From the leadership to start mobilizing. We were doing a full mobilization of the Minnesota Guard. I came out to Camp Ripley after about the 8th phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and drove to Camp Ripley and assisted where I could. And as I said, we activated pretty much everybody. It was a full activation. We have over 10,000 soldiers in the Minnesota Guard. I think by the time you take away those that were actually at training exercises or deployed or at basic training and such, it was probably somewhere close to 7,000. And we all reported to locations in the Twin Cities that we could operate, and broke up different patrols and such around different sectors of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the soldiers themselves were utilized throughout cities, guarding precincts, guarding fire stations, setting up traffic control points. I got into the cities about probably 3 p.m. and went straight to the armory there in Cedar Street by the state capitol. And then we started shift rotations. I would work about 6 o'clock in the evening to about 8 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock in the morning to about 8 o'clock at night. I stayed outside the city with friends of ours that lived in the metro. And it was just such a strange experience to drive down Highway 35E, drive 694 with absolutely no cars, because we were in the midst of the pandemic as well, so very little traffic. But when I would leave in the evenings, the governor had a curfew in place that would shut down the interstates. They had all of our snowplow trucks would actually come onto the on-ramps and clear traffic, not literally with the snowplows, but acting as a deterrent to keep people. So they would just basically go up the interstates, and they would drift people off to shut down the interstates to keep the main arteries coming into Minneapolis closed, and St. Paul. And never seen anything like it.
I hope we never see anything like it again.
Yeah. So things.
How many days did this go on for you, for the Guard?
I came down on a Saturday, and I left with the last leadership groups. We had started demobilizing or taking the soldiers off state active duty probably by Thursday, Friday of the following week. And then Sunday was just, I stayed on until Sunday because we were basically just wrapping up and getting accountability, and just from a staff leadership perspective. But was home by Sunday afternoon. So it was, I guess it was 8 days that I was there, because I remember getting home on a Sunday evening or so. We managed here in the Minnesota Guard, had to manage the COVID outbreaks in many different ways, putting people on orders for helping out in nursing homes, helping out in testing sites. Once the trials for the officers involved in the shooting or in the death of George Floyd, we had called up a bunch of soldiers again in March and April of 2021, and supported that as well in different capacities. So has been a very active career and very busy. I still anticipate staying in the Guard probably for another 5 or 6 years. If my career progresses where I would hope, I would probably end up with about 38 years of service in the Army National Guard and multiple deployments. So
that's a full career.
Time to retire. What's that?
That's a full career.
That would be full career, and I'd be about ready to retire.
Well, so you've already done a lot. I mean,
yeah, I guess so.
Maybe your last 5 years will be a little tamer.
Yeah, that would be appreciated too. So, with all that, the Army has been so good to me. I love living in Minnesota. I love the lakes. I love the snow in the winters. My sons and I go snowmobiling, and my wife really likes the beaches. So hopefully, when opportunities present themselves, we'll go south and spend time on the Gulf Coast and the Florida area, in the future, and get things to slow down a little bit.
So in your military career, Chris, is there anything you wish you'd have done different? You've had a pretty full career.
Yeah, we always joke that the Air Force may have been a better route to go. Probably less tents, probably less MREs, less miserable food. The Air Force seems to have it pretty good, but I do love the Army. It has historically, I being someone who loved history, I love studying the history of the Army and things of that sort. So I don't know that I would do anything differently. I've been very blessed. I've been able to do and achieve what I wanted to. I've appreciated the responsibilities that I've been given and the rank that I've been able to be promoted to and the leadership opportunities I've been given. So it's been very good to me.
So you came to Argyle on Veterans Day one year and spoke for us. Have you spoke at quite a few different?
I have spoken probably recently at more Veterans Days events and Memorial Day events than I had in the past. Just because I was asked. So I did do the Veterans Day program in Long Prairie, a couple of them, I guess, in 2021, and then I did the Memorial Day service in Long Prairie for American Legion this past May. I was up in Argyle, was able to be there, and my dad had received his longevity certificate, so was able to.
50 years.
Yeah, 50 years. So that was a lot of fun to surprise him and be a part of that.
Well, Chris, anything else you want to add about your military career?
No, I think that that's been pretty in depth, and it still is hard to think back when you mentioned basic and AIT. That is 32 years ago, and some of those memories, they have to get rejogged, but there's been so many experiences since that time that those kind of fade away until I get reminded of them, but they're certainly not as prevalent as they maybe once were with the different things that I've been able to do.
I just want to add something, Chris. I know you brought up 911 when that happened, and for a lot of Vietnam veterans, after 911, a lot of them came out of the closet.
Yeah.
I mean, the military was looked at in a different way after that, I think.
Yeah, I would agree, and we were so appreciative of the support that the Vietnam veterans and Vietnam era service members gave the post 9/11 soldiers and airmen and sailors that recognized what that meant and wanted to make certain that we didn't experience what many Vietnam era veterans experienced, and that was so appreciated.
Yep. Well, Chris, if you don't have anything else, I want to thank you for your service. It's extended service, and really appreciate you doing this interview.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.